You're listening to the Republic Broadcasting Network, where you'll find out what the Fukushima's going on.
And hello, America. I don't know why we had an echo there for a second, but welcome to our show here. It is Friday, October 20th, 2017, and end of a week. Thank goodness it's Friday. Thank goodness it's Friday. I don't know about you. I could use a nice, restful weekend. This last week, between computer problems and power and light and internet and all the rest of it, was a little frustrating, and I think I need to strive for some Zen-like calm over the next few days. The phone lines are open, 800-313-9443. Mike is in our control room, ready to answer the phone when you call on in. Quick little program note. Yes, the lovely Lady Claire will be joining us in hour number 3 today with her unique perspective on the world. So let's get right on into it here. Obviously, right now, the biggest story in the independent media, certainly, and now on Fox News, is the uranium deal. It is a huge corruption, bribery scandal. It's probably the biggest one in all of U.S. history. And the deafening silence from the left wing, Hillary's supporters, most of the corporate media, except for Fox News, it really underscores how scared they are of this. And I think all of these people engaged in this kind of massive corruption because they were convinced Hillary was going to win the White House or steal the White House, and they wouldn't have to worry about any kind of prosecutions. And that's why they've all been on the attack against Donald Trump ever since he won the election. Because if he ever takes a moment to take a look at what's going on, and he's obviously paying attention to this, you're going to see some real investigations and real prosecution, because I'm sure a lot of people in the federal government now understand their credibility and legitimacy as a whole is now on the line if they fail to act. Same thing with the corporate media. Now, interestingly enough, all the way back in June of this year, CNBC's Barton Romo grilled John Podesta on Uranium One in Russia. So it's not like they don't know the story was out there, didn't know the story was out there, but it got hushed up. And now the corporate media is getting defensive about the story here. Andre Mitchell literally came on out and said, we've covered the Uranium One story. We gave it 92 seconds of coverage 2 years ago. So what do you mean a blackout, media blackout? I mean, that is really lame. Still lots of coverage on Donald Trump's phone call to the Gold Star widow. A lot of coverage dwindling on the NFL, dwindling on Weinstein, but that's what they're focusing on, all this stuff. They're still going on about the phone call. More about that a little bit later. But basically what we're talking about is that interests within the Russian nuclear industry were bribing U.S. officials to get their hands on America's uranium ore. 20% of American uranium was transferred to the control of the Russians. You know, those people that the corporate media have been saying all those bad things about, those Russians. And what do you make out of uranium? Well, you can make paint, if you don't mind glowing in the dark. You can make nuclear power stations with it. You can also make bombs. And the FBI had an inside informant. They knew what was going on. They've got hard evidence. And basically, Hillary Clinton, as Secretary of State, was in a position to approve or deny the deal. She approved it, and $145 million poured into the Clinton Foundation. There is definitely a story here. And the corporate media is out there. Who's interested in that stuff? Who's interested? But like I said, Fox News is out there finally doing a good job. Lou Dobbs just went after Attorney General Jeff Sessions last night about this whole issue. And so everybody in the government has to know that everybody in the country knows what's going on. And that's why I say the legitimacy and credibility of the entire government is now on the line. It was severely damaged when James Comey read off that list of Title 18 felony violations Hillary Clinton committed with her email server and then gave her a free pass. So apparently the FBI for a decade ran an operation called Ghost Stories to monitor and rip apart a deep-cover Russian agent network. And apparently they arrested 10 of the spies in June of 2010. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton worked feverishly to get the Russian agents sent back to Moscow in a hastily arranged, lopsided deal with Putin. It kind of reminds me about the dancing Israelis who turned out to be Mossad agents on 9/11 and how they were very quickly sent back to Israel. And the liberals are circling the wagons here. A former press secretary for Bill Clinton, Peter, basically came on out attacking Peter Schweitzer over this story. He said, how dare you? I mean, how dare you dare to dare? This is not going to go away. We're not going to let this go away. We're repeating the lesson of the Downing Street memo, where it was a major story in the independent media for like a month, and finally the corporate media had to look at it. Dismissively, but they looked at it. We're going to do a shout-out now to our on-air affiliates who are just now rejoining the network. Meanwhile, over on Hannity's program, he's basically announced the House Committee is now looking into this matter and looking into the issue that there were 2,800 Huma Abedin government documents on Anthony Weiner's laptop. And according to Judge Napolitano, it will lead to a Clinton indictment if the FBI reopens the case. So again, FBI, your credibility as an institution is on the line. Reopen the investigation or be seen by all of America as part of that corrupted swamp. And they are getting scared here. They are getting scared. And they're trying to stall. They're trying to delay. And apparently in one of the actions for Judicial Watch, the Department of State is saying it still has 40,000 Hillary documents that the FBI found. They still need to process them, and they won't be able to turn them over until 2020. That's a stonewall. Now, getting back over to Fusion GPS, two of their top figures, Peter Fritsch and Thomas Cotton, have now officially pled the Fifth Amendment, which is as much as saying, yeah, they did something wrong, and they know they did something wrong, and they're going to shut up about it. But Senator Grassley has come on out with another interesting question, because apparently Fusion GPS made use of paid assets within the corporate media to spread their opposition research, a.k.a. smears. And so Senator Grassley wants to know which journalists in Washington, D.C. were given financial incentives to spread that Trump dossier in the media. A pay-for-play operation. So it's just getting worse and worse. Now, to show you how scared they're getting, they're pulling out all the old guard. George W. Bush is out there saying, oh, he's a racist. And they're trying to get everybody to come on out and defend the liberal establishment from the liberals' own actions. And so former Attorney General Eric Holder, who was Attorney General under Obama before Loretta Lynch, came on out and defended James Comey for drafting an exoneration letter before completing the Clinton investigation. And Holder is out there saying, it's no big deal. He's an honest guy, and he just sort of knew right at the beginning this investigation had no merit, and it was a good faith assessment by a person who I think has done a lot for this country. Man, oh man. Anybody in the fertilizer business, just back the truck up there to Washington, D.C., because it's just pouring out the windows there. Meanwhile, Eric Holder is openly out there. He came out and said he's part of the Trump resistance. And remember, Eric Holder was one of the people who okayed that Uranium One deal. And so now he's part of the Trump resistance. Like I said, they engaged in all of this massive bribery, corruption, selling out America's uranium to Russia because they were convinced Hillary would steal the White House and they wouldn't have to worry about investigations or prosecutions or anything. And Trump won with so many Americans voted him. It was a landslide that overcame the election fraud. And remember, we now know there's at least 11,000 documented cases of election fraud in last year. I'm sorry, 1,100. Is that 1,100, 11,000? I have to go back and look at the number. It's a huge number in every single state. And that's why they're all panicking, why they're out there trying to get rid of Donald Trump, because they know that he still has another 3 years to bring prosecutions against them. And now you've got committees in both the House and the Senate are saying, we have to look at this. The American people know what went on. We have to deal with it. We're going to take a phone call from Dustin in New Jersey. Aloha. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Yeah, hi, Mike. I think you'll probably talk about this later, about Bahrain looking to buy the S-400 missile system now.
It actually wasn't on the list of talking points, but yes. Everybody wants that S-400 now.
Yep, because they're rolling out the S-500, I believe, next year. But, hey, Mike, ConocoPhillips, is that a British or a French company? Because I saw the Kurds handed back the largest gas field to the Russians in Syria, and it said Conoco gas field. Is that ConocoPhillips, a French company?
Okay. Could you give me that one more time?
Yeah, the Kurds handed back the gas fields to the Russians in Syria, the largest gas field in Syria. It's like Conoco gas field. I wonder if that's ConocoPhillips, which was that a British company maybe or French?
It may be. I actually don't know where ConocoPhillips is domiciled. It's a multinational, but I don't know where their corporate headquarters are. I think it may be British, but I'm not sure about that.
Yeah, because there's an oil refinery that's the largest oil refinery in Syria, and that's probably the last big thing to grab. And I know each side's racing to grab it now. But why would the Kurds give that back? Maybe because the U.S. basically dumped them?
Well, we know that the Kurds have just made a huge deal with Russia for oil because they're feeling betrayed by the U.S. And pressured by Iran. But as far as Syria is concerned, it isn't necessarily the refinery. Everybody's racing to control that one last really large oil field and its revenues. And I think it's in the back of some people's minds that Syria is still going to resolve itself with some kind of a partitioning, and that they want the oil fields to be in their partition.
And then one more quick thing. I just want to let you know they're looking at the Super Hornet, the F-18 Super Hornet, to do some upgrades on it now, because maybe they're seeing the writing on the wall with the F-35. So maybe they're just going to look at the existing platforms we got. F-18 and F-16 are great planes, and they should have just upgraded them from the beginning instead of But you know how it's a money pit.
Well, it is, and there's also the fact that the F-16 and the F-18 are not radar stealthy, which was the whole big deal of pushing into the F-22 and the F-35. But even upgrading an aircraft may not work. We were going to mention this later in the show. An upgraded American F-4 Phantom crashed on takeoff in Japan. The crew escaped, but again, it indicates that these weapon systems are actually very fragile.
And Mike, the Su-30, which was that the first plane that uses that vector nozzle thrust? I believe the F-22 was our first plane that uses. So the Russians had that actually, I believe, for quite a while.
Yes.
Before we had. So they're on their next, with the PAC T-50, which is their stealth fighter. That has probably a next generation version. So we're kind of behind on that also, besides missile tech.
Yeah, and we are. Russia's led the way on a lot of tech. You remember that swing wing on the F-111? That was copied from a Russian design.
All right, thanks, Mike. Have a great show.
All right, thanks an awful lot. We're going to let you go here. Now, getting on back to the news. You've probably been hearing about this lady, Frederica Wilson. She's a Democratic representative, and she's at the forefront of keeping this whole Trump phone call to the gold medal widow, how inappropriate, he was rude and insensitive to her. And basically a lot of people are saying it is unconscionable how Frederica Wilson politicized the Trump phone call. Now, the widow herself, just appalled at how everybody was trying to distort the story, has now posted the video that was being made of that phone call in its entirety. And it's very respectful. It's very complimentary. And again, it's another huge nothing burger coming on out there by these liberal Democrats who are desperate to get rid of Trump before some of them start getting thrown in jail. Meanwhile, Frederica Wilson has now come out accusing White House Chief of Staff John Kelly of racism. It almost seems like that's become the automatic knee-jerk reaction of the liberals. If you're not winning your argument, just scream you're a racist and, stomp out indignantly. And it's gone a little bit too far, and it's worn out. By the way, side note, for all her talk about the gold medal widow and the soldier who died and everything, U.S. Representative Frederica Wilson has voted against 10 House bills to help veterans. So again, she's not really on the side of the veterans. She's just seizing an opportunity to go after Donald Trump yet again. Now, in brief, this is going to be the only story about Harvey Weinstein that we're going to do today because we got so much else to talk about. Ann Coulter came out with an interesting article explaining why Harvey Weinstein got away with what he was doing for so long, because apparently Weinstein has a lot of allies in the corporate media. And basically Tina Brown, one of Weinstein's erstwhile cleanup gals, told Charlie Rose, what I found really unsettling was how many journalists, frankly, were on his payroll. So, again, a big part of the fault for why Harvey Weinstein was able to get away with what he was doing for so long was the corporate media. They were protecting him, same way they were protecting Hillary Clinton, same way they're still trying to protect Hillary Clinton. Now, there is a company, Esponda Productions, LLC, and they produced a documentary about the pedophile problem in Hollywood. And it's currently linked to the front page of whatreallyhappened.com. And for a limited time, you can watch it for free. This isn't pirated. This isn't stolen. This is the production company itself putting it up on Vimeo and saying, yeah, come and look at this. We've been talking about this for a very, very long time, and for a limited time, you can watch the documentary for free. And after that, it will be for sale, and they're promising that the proceeds from the sales are going to go to charities that deal with these abused children, these abused child stars. But it's a bit of an eye-opener. Now, getting on to the war zones here, Russia right now is almost the only source of humanitarian aid going into Syria. Iran is helping a little bit. Virtually nothing from the United Nations, nothing from the United States, nothing from the other Western countries. Now, there's a refugee camp, the Rukban refugee camp. It's located on the Syrian-Jordanian border in the so-called deconfliction zone arbitrarily established by the United States around 10th. And they're facing a humanitarian disaster because the Americans are using aviation, rocket, and artillery systems to prevent Syrian government workers from entering the zone. And there's 60,000 people in there. They're threatened with starvation. They have no access to fresh water. Well, if it works in Yemen, it'll work in Syria. We'll be right back. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show here. We're talking about the war zones, and there are plenty of them. And apparently there's another one of these billionaires who's going to finance an impeach Donald Trump campaign. In this case, it's on the basis that Trump has brought us to the edge of nuclear war. And while I'm always very suspicious of billionaires talking about impeachment, I have to agree. For me, the single biggest disappointment in Donald Trump was his war policy, because he campaigned on no more foreign interventions, and here we are, interventions up to our nostrils. Meanwhile, the U.S. Department of State has now officially admitted that militants linked to al-Nusra Front are carrying out terrorist attacks using chemical weapons in Syria. And Russia's defense ministry is saying, effectively, it's about time. So, yeah, but what has the corporate media been telling you all this time? Oh, it's Assad. It's Assad. Trust us. It's Assad. He's bad, 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 bad. You know, our U.S.-backed forces would never, ever, ever do anything like that. Now the State Department says that they have. Now, interestingly enough, there is this group that claims to be fighting against Russian propaganda and fake news. And they're now asking a reporter not to pursue information on the CIA's arming of the Syrian rebels. The group is called Prop or Not. They're famous for being an ex-source for the Washington Post. And they're saying the story might fall into the wrong hands, you know, like we the American people. So Jason Leopold, who's a senior investigative reporter at BuzzFeed, tweeted that he'd filed a Freedom of Information Act lawsuit against the CIA for documents related to the U.S. arming Syrian rebels. And Prop or Not is already out there saying, please don't do that. Really, that information is too dangerous to allow out. It'll get into the wrong hands, like the American people, and then what will they think of us? Probably about what we think of you right now. Seriously. There's been an explosion inside a mosque in Kabul, Afghanistan, casualties reported. And I know it almost seems like in this day and age another terrorist attack is no big deal. My concern, however, is that this sudden surge of terror attacks in Afghanistan could be seized on by the U.S. government as an excuse to escalate the situation in Afghanistan. Because they've been stuck in that quagmire for years. In fact, the U.S. war on Afghanistan is the longest war in our entire history. 16 years. We have kids starting high school who weren't even alive when this war started. And they're trying to figure out a way to send more troops and convince the war-weary American people that, yeah, so far we haven't done much in Afghanistan except secure a pipeline route and a reliable supply of opium, but yes, let's go on in and give them what for. Now, as I mentioned to Dustin in New Jersey, the Kurdistan Regional Government in Iraq has announced it has signed a deal with the Russian state-owned oil corporation Rosneft that would allow the company to begin developing oil blocks worth a potential $400 million to the Kurds. This is probably going to up the ante, so to speak, from Iraq's point of view. But again, the more the U.S. and the West are pushing on these countries, the more they pivot to Russia. This is a failed policy. And they keep on doing it, which is the definition of insanity, doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different outcome. Now, this is an alarming development here. Apparently, head of the CIA, Pompeo, is out there obsessing about the Islamic Republic's continued testing of ballistic missiles. And he's announced that the CIA is going to become a much more vicious agency in fighting their adversaries. The CIA are not the swell bunch of guys you see in the movies or read about in the Tom Clancy novels. We all wish they were, but they aren't. We'll be right back. Aloha, America. Welcome back to our show here. Now, interestingly enough, we're seeing this continued debate over the Iran deal, and Trump's already refused to recertify. He's basically destroyed the credibility of the U.S. government with other governments around the world. And the war hawks are all out there saying, yes, now we can go have war with Iran. Well, if you really feel that way, Here are your jumpsuits, here are your rifles, and here are your parachutes. You guys go on, have fun, leave the rest of us alone here. It turns out, though, that according to the latest polls, 3/4 of Americans support the current Iran deal. So Trump is not operating from his base here. And yes, it's one of the areas where he did campaign on this issue that as president he would tear down the Iran deal. But it's how it's being done that is creating a political backlash that is going to haunt the United States government's international relationships for decades to come. And again, more and more countries are beginning to realize that the issue here is whether or not nations have a right to self-defense in the face of an obviously rogue, belligerent nation that is trying to gobble up the rest of the world. And of course, yes, everybody has a right to defense, even down to us individual citizens. That's what the Second Amendment is about. We have a right to defend ourselves. So Putin is wagging his finger again at the U.S. government for failing to keep their end of a bargain in a host of international disarmament agreements. We were talking the other day about the chemical weapons. Russia has destroyed, all their biological weapons, and the U.S. is out there saying, oh, we forgot about these over here. And they have the largest stockpile of these weapons on Earth. And so basically, speaking at a question and answer session at the Valdai Discussion Club in Sochi, Putin began by recalling the megatons to megawatts program, which ran between 1993 and 2013 and saw Russia downblend enriched uranium from the equivalent about 20,000 nuclear warheads were decommissioned, and they took the highly enriched uranium and they diluted it down to low enriched uranium to be used as fuel by U.S. power stations. And then the U.S. turns around and starts doing things like bombing Belgrade. Right now, the U.S. government has a serious problem. No other government on earth trusts them, and with very, very good reason. The U.S. government has a serious credibility problem of its own making, and I have no sympathy for them whatsoever. Now, one possible aspect of this loss of trust is that Russia has announced they have no intention to join the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, as it is of destabilizing nature. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said at the Moscow Non-Proliferation Conference on Friday, he said, we're concerned over the fact we're approaching the 2020 review conference under the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons with disquieting results so far. The destructive actions by some states, which have broken the consensus on the draft final document of the previous conference, have done considerable damage to the viability of the treaty. So now the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty may collapse. And again, the U.S. violated that, certainly in Iran. Under the terms of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the U.S. is obligated to help nations develop peaceful uses of nuclear energy, like power stations. And frankly, if the U.S. government had really been concerned about a secret bomb factory underneath Iran's power station, the way Israel has under Dimona, the obvious solution is go on in there, offer your help pour the foundations, lay the wiring, put in the piping and everything, and then you know that it's just a power station. But it was far more amenable to the war agenda to just sit back in the U.S. and say, oh, we know Iran is doing all these terrible things here, even though the IAEA says, yeah. And again, by using the threat of military force to convince Iran, to coerce Iran, rather, to surrender its rights under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, it puts the U.S. in the wrong yet again under international law. Meanwhile, Nikki Haley over at the United Nations is out there screaming that Russia's meddling in our election is warfare. They've committed an act of war against us. When a country can come interfere in another country's elections, that is warfare. There's only one problem with that. There's no evidence that Russia interfered with the election. All of the election fraud discovered so far from last year's election was being done by the liberals, and it all favored Hillary Clinton. There just wasn't enough of it. And even the head of the CIA is saying if there was any Russian meddling, it was too small to have any real effect. Certainly far less effect than all those millions of illegal immigrants who voted, those however many dead people who voted in 2 different states. There was massive election fraud last year, but it wasn't Russia that was doing it. I think Russia, to be very honest, would have been much happier with Hillary Clinton as president because she is blackmailable over that Uranium One deal, and she would have been the perfect Russian candidate in office, the perfect Russian puppet, a president of the United States of America who will do whatever Russia says. That's what Hillary Clinton would have been. She's trying to say that that's what Trump is. She's just projecting her own guilt because she had to know if she did this deal with Russia, she's open to blackmail by Russia. But she didn't care. Just the lure of that money, $145 million. I can't even conceive of how much money that is. I know it's a lot. I can see how many zeros there are there. We have been talking about the deterioration of our military preparedness. We've been at war in all these different countries for 16 years. We're using up our stockpiles. We're wearing out the military machinery, tanks, trucks, planes. They're not designed to last a very, very long time because the models are, once they go into combat, their lifespan is measured maybe in a few months. So they're not built to last 5 or 10 years. We've been talking about the obvious problems with command of our Navy ships, with the USS Fitzgerald and the USS John S. McCain ignoring the rules of the road, so to speak, right of way, and getting into these horrible accidents. And now there's apparently another problem over on one of the ships over there at North Korea. And apparently the cruiser Shiloh, there's a huge morale problem. And it's coming on out where the sailors on board are saying they hate their ship. That's a really bad thing. You want the sailors to feel like that ship is their home. You want them to love that ship so that they'll care for it. And if they hate the ship, you're not going to get quality work. Apparently, one shipmate said it's only a matter of time before something horrible happens. Another sailor, our sailors do not trust the CO. Another one said it's a floating prison. Another sailor said, I just pray we never have to shoot down a missile from North Korea because then our ineffectiveness will really show. And apparently a big part of the problem is the commanding officer's micromanagement, and apparently minor on-the-job mistakes often led to time in the brig on a diet of bread and water. I mean, seriously, Captain Bligh is not a model. He's not a role model for the Navy. He messed up on the Bounty. He pushed his men too hard, and there comes a breaking point. And by the way, after the mutiny on the Bounty, Captain Bligh was actually briefly governor of Sydney, Australia. And he did the same thing there, and it resulted in a revolution and a backlash. A crew on a ship has to be a team. And yes, there is the captain, and there's a chain of command, but you still have to realize it is a team working together, not just the captain up there saying, do this, do that, or I'll throw you in the brig. The Navy has a serious personnel problem. As I mentioned earlier in the show, there was apparently this Japanese Air Force base, and they had this updated, maintained Phantom F-4. They were about to go on a training flight from Hikari Air Base in Ibaraki Prefecture in eastern Japan, and apparently the jet just burst into flames just before takeoff. And fortunately, the flight crew got out. They were able to run away to safety. Now, here's something really weird. As you know, Great Britain has been suckered into buying the F-35. And this idea of globalization really comes back to haunt you in the event of war, because right now, the British F-35 engines have to be sent to Turkey when they need an overhaul, which is a regular occurring thing. There's a lot of wear and tear on those military jet engines. And see, if you get into a war and all of a sudden Turkey's on the other side, you start getting into trouble. How do you get your engines overhauled? Now, of course, back in World War II, all the weapons being used were domestically produced by the countries using them, for the most part. There were some exports. Italy was exporting to one side at the start of the war and to the other side at the other end of the war. But like the British Spitfire was produced almost entirely in Great Britain. This idea of a distributed procurement chain for the military across the globe, that's very vulnerable. It's very fragile if the world goes to a shooting war. Let's take a phone call here. Terry in Oregon, aloha. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Hey, Mike, this phone call that President Trump made to this woman, lost her son or husband in Nigeria in a war.
Yes.
The people's reaction to that in this country is, we were at war in Africa? Gee, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
And that's true, because they fight these wars and they don't bother telling us, and usually a war is a top thing on the news every night. I know in Vietnam we had reporters everywhere, and of course the bad feeling that produces one of the things that lost the war for us. So they've gotten wise over the years. There's two things that defeat your country. One is showing what's really happening in our wars on television every night, and number two is the draft. So they don't have the draft, and they're not telling us about these wars. But including me, I mean, I'd like to know what's going on in Africa. Do you happen to know all the operations we're involved in over there?
I don't know all of them, and as this incident in Niger just showed, it is being withheld from the American people. And maybe the reason they're trying to make a big stink over Donald Trump's phone call to this Gold Star widow is that they're trying to keep people from asking, the next obvious question: what the heck are we doing in Niger in the first place?
Right. And the rest of Africa, I mean, that's not the only one. We got stuff on Somalia, and
yes.
Israelis are bombing Sudan on a regular basis. And I'm sure we got stuff going to Sudan because there's oil in southern Sudan, and we want to get our hands in that. And, of course, it's a war on terror, right, Mike?
Yeah, well, it's sold to us as the war on terror, but the reality is that the American continent and Europe and Asia have been pretty much mined out. And Africa remains the world's largest undeveloped pool of resources. Now, oil, gold, rare metals, all that stuff. And it's up there for grabs. And AFRICOM was created to project U.S. military power into Africa to control those resources. And that's why the U.S. government is so upset about China now having a military base in Africa.
Well, China also signed a bunch of agreements with a bunch of African countries on their minerals.
That's exactly
years
right.
ago, because they said the U.S. was saying, human rights, we can't do business with you, and China says, that's none of our business. We'll go ahead and sign a deal with you. It's just business between you and me. We're going to keep our nose out of your politics. But of course, we couldn't do that. But now, everything we seem to do has a negative effect on our foreign policy.
Well, in the case of the U.S., they may scream human rights, but as we've seen in these U.S.-dominated war zones, it's all talk. And the real issue is screaming about a government's human rights record is usually part of the early propaganda to start to demonize them ahead of some kind of a regime change operation, because from the U.S. point of view, it's much more profitable to go in and regime change a nation and have the new puppet government sell those resources at lowered prices than to go on in and do a fair market deal. That was the whole rationale behind the U.S. putting Batista into power in Cuba, because Batista impoverished the Cuban people by selling Cuba's agricultural produce at way below market rates to American companies like PepsiCo and United Fruit. And when the inevitable revolution came about and Batista fled and Castro took on over, and the U.S. said, we're going to embargo you. And the irony there is Fidel Castro, the first thing he said when he took power in Cuba is he said to the U.S., I want to be friends with you guys. You know, we want to go on selling you agricultural produce, bananas, sugar, and the rest of it. And the U.S. said, well, we still want those discounts we had under Batista. And Castro said, I can't do that. I'm going to charge you the fair market price. And that's when the U.S. declared the embargo. And that's what forced Cuba into the Soviet sphere of influence. So they keep making these same mistakes over and over again.
Right. Today we're sending a lot of countries into the Soviet sphere of influence. And pretty soon we're going to be staying there by ourselves.
Well, it's the Russian sphere of influence. The Soviets are gone. It's the Russian sphere of influence, but it's the same mechanism. The more the U.S. tries to bully all these other countries, the more it is driving them into alliances with Russia and China. It's a failed policy, and apparently nobody in Washington, D.C. has the gonadal tissue to stand up and say, this isn't working, we need a rethink.
Exactly. But back to the African wars, I don't know how many are going, and I do not know how many American troops are in Africa.
I don't know either, but I'll tell you what, I'll try and find out. We got to let you go, take a break for commercials. We'll be right back. Aloha America, welcome back to the show here, and Fox News is actually covering the story where this school in Massachusetts canceled the Halloween parade because it wasn't politically correct enough. We're going to go back to the telephones now. Eduardo in Miami, aloha. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Aloha, Mike. First of all, I want to thank you for your excellent website and radio program, which broadcasts the truth. There's one point I want to make regarding Batista, as you mentioned, Cuba. Fulgencio Batista was dictator before Castro, but people don't know that he was a personal friend of Angel Castro and from the same hometown of Beirán Oriente.
Okay.
There was two things that happened for the Cuban Revolution was that, first of all, it was the Bank 5, which is a national Cuban bank which Cuba had no debt. They actually had a surplus of funds, and they opened up a new bank for the production of agriculture and industry in Cuba. And at the same time, in 1947, Cuba voted against the partition of Palestine in the vote of the United Nations. Of course, that takes the wrath of the people that basically owned the United States, and they decided, well, let's get rid of them because they're costing us a problem. First of all, they have a bank that they don't want us to get into and be able to collect their usurious funds. And second of all, they voted against us and basically the whole world against the partition of Palestine. There's two facts. And my point is that Fidel Castro is not really an enemy of the United States.
No,
he has been the closest ally of the United States.
He never wanted to be the enemy of the United States.
For example, he sent over 50,000 Cuban troops to Angola for the purpose of protecting the wells of the Rockefellers. You know, these are facts that are not that well known. And actually, I'm realizing I live in Miami and I'm Cuban. It's actually a hard fact that's shocking to a lot of people to have this paradigm of U.S. versus Cuba. And there is no U.S. versus Cuba. It's U.S. ordering Cuba, and I believe Castro was a government agent. I mean, he lived 4 years in Los Angeles. He went to acting school, and his family is both of, I'll just say non-Spanish extraction, both from his father's side and his mother's side. His mother was the maid of Castro, which was a Turkish, Jewish descent.
Okay.
So these few things, and first of all, and Fulgencio Batista, as a matter of fact, was Raul Castro, the current dictator of Cuba. His godfather was Batista. Now that's on the internet. You can actually confirm that. So what the paradigm is that the supposed heroes of the revolution are basically agents of Washington sent to destroy Cuba for their lack of obedience to the masters in New York and
they may have started as U.S. agents, but as was proved with Saddam Hussein, the U.S. government won't hesitate to turn on their own agents. Have to let you go, Eduardo. We need to do station identification.
Absolutely.
We'll be right back. Aloha, America. Welcome back to our show, hour number 2. The phone lines are open, 800-313-9443. Let's get into the economic news here. As you know, the corporate media is just celebrating the Dow has crossed 23,000. It's heading for 24,000. Nowhere to go but up, which is what they were saying in October of 1929, I think it was. But again, we have people like Paul Craig Roberts who are out there saying it's all an illusion. They're just pouring money in to Wall Street to make it look like it's profitable and drive those stocks up to use them as a political banner. See, the economy's wonderful. Look at the stock market. You know, how can you complain about how can you even think that the recession is not over? Look at the stock market. Look how rich these people are all becoming. But it is all an illusion. The stock market is totally disconnected from the real U.S. economy right now. And even worse, there's the problem of overvaluation. Now, normally in a healthy stock market, the price of the stock should reflect that stock's underlying value in terms of its earnings, dividends, what have you. There's a ratio between price and earnings. When you start using market forces and manipulation to drive up the price of a stock, you start creating a gap between what the stock's price is and what it actually should be based on the value of the underlying stock. And that can be a bit of a problem because it means that elevated price is existing without any real support. Now, right now, stocks are very heavily overvalued because of all the manipulation, and they're almost twice as overvalued as they were in 1987 before that crash occurred, and that took about 20% off the market. I remember when that one happened. Everybody was just in a panic. This idea that there's no place to go but up, it's a typical Wall Street fantasy. It's never been proven out in history. It's all fakery. It's plunge protection team. It's manipulation to placate the masses. Oh, we've got wonderfully low unemployment and wonderfully high stock market. Everything's going along just fine. But like I said, if you want to know what's really going on in the United States, walk down your nearest town and open your eyes and look at it as if you are a tourist from someplace else. See all the cracks in the pavement, the corroded metal, the decayed infrastructure, the retail vacancies. We're getting ready to hit the holiday shopping season, and there's a lot of retail vacancies down there at the local mall. We have iconic retailers going out of business, Retail-mageddon, because people, ordinary people like you and I, we just don't have the money to spend. Anyway, now, over in Great Britain, computer reseller Misco has been forced into administration, which is their term for bankruptcy, and so that's lost about 300 jobs there. The real problem, though, in Europe, as it is here in America, is the derivatives exposure. Now, we haven't talked about this for a while, so a quick little recap. A derivative is any financial instrument whose worth is based on another financial transaction. And the most commonly used one, abused one, is what is called an interest swap. And what that basically means is if I go to a company and I buy $100,000 worth of their stock, or I invest $100,000 in their stock, I go to the same brokerage and I get a swap, which acts like an insurance policy, where if the company goes bust and I lose my investment, I get at least part of it coming back from the swap. It's kind of like an insurance policy, but there are key differences that you need to keep in mind. One is in regular insurance, like fire insurance, you have to own the asset being insured. That doesn't apply to these interest swaps. You can make these bets on other people's transactions. One of the things that Goldman Sachs was criticized for was helping California issue their California bonds, then turn around and started betting against the California bond by selling swaps against it. And there's no limit to how many of these policies you can take out on the same transaction. They're unregulated, and the providers of these derivatives are not required to keep capital reserves on hand to pay expected losses. That's what drove AIG out of business back in 2008. Well, everybody loves derivatives. They're like instant money. As long as the economy is going up, you just take the money in the front door. You don't worry about paying it out. But that never lasts. And right now, the European Union has more than 450 trillion pounds, with a T, trillion, of exposure to derivatives. And it's estimated that the total derivative exposure around the world is close to $1 quadrillion. That's more than basically the entire planet is worth right now. And it's all paper magic. It's all bookkeeping. None of it's real. But this is what happens when you allow the money junkies to operate without any kind of reasonable controls. They're addicted to gambling because that's what Wall Street is. It's a giant open-air gambling casino. And everybody there is hopped up on the action, the excitement, the adrenaline, the cocaine. Wolf of Wall Street is a true story. If you haven't seen that movie, and if you do watch it, you might want to keep the kids out of the room. Now, we're going to do a shout-out now to our on-air affiliates who are just now rejoining our network. Now, over in Canada, the Bank of Nova Scotia is getting ready to try and sell its gold business, Scotia Mocatta. And this is following a massive money laundering scandal centered on a U.S. refinery that involves smuggled gold from South America. Now, like diamonds, there are supposed to be these legitimate sources of gold, and then there's gold coming from people we don't like. And there's a lot of gold smuggling and gold laundering. And, of course, the wonderful thing about gold is you can melt it, recast it. There's no way to trace it back to where it came from. So Scotiabank is having to dump their precious metals division. Getting on back to Europe, their secession problems are not going to go away anytime soon. You've had the Catalan vote. Now you've got Lombardy and Veneto referendums that are being planned. And Scotland is now talking about a second independence referendum, knowing that the first one was subject to massive election fraud. There's talk of France leaving the EU, Germany, Belgium, and Romania. It's starting to come apart, and the globalists are just absolutely having cows. Now, over in Madrid, one of their politicians, Jose Maria Aznar, is getting ready to take a page from Hillary Clinton's book and blame the entire Catalan push for independence on Russia. It's those evil Russians, they're doing it. Russia's being blamed for everything. Russia extincted the woolly mammoths. Russia is stealing socks out of your dryer. It really is ridiculous here. Now the Czech Republic is talking about holding a referendum on leaving the EU, according to the leader of one of their far-right parties. And these far-right Eurosceptic parties, they're coming on strong. Look at the losses suffered by Angela Merkel in Germany. Look at the results of the recent Austrian elections. The ordinary people have had enough with this empire building at their expense. They want to go back to being their own little nation with their own culture and their own history. All right, we're going to take a phone call. Thomas in Texas, aloha. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Aloha, brother.
Aloha, brah.
You got them, bro. What's on my mind is you remember, I think it was during the, I can't remember if it was the Bush administration or the Clinton administration, when there was an edict that, or whatever, that the mainstream media, they conglomerated.
Okay.
Are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay, they conglomerated. All right, well, we need to do away with that. You know, that one company cannot own all of the media.
Well,
and
it used to be that way in this country. There were laws that limited how much media any one entity could own.
Used to be.
Yeah.
There you go. Used to be.
But starting with the Iraq War, in fact, the first Iraq War, the one that was over Kuwait, the U.S. government made a deal with the heads of these media organizations, and they said, if you will embed your reporters with our troops, if you will report the war the way we want it reported, we will get rid of those laws that limit how much media you can own. And so the big corporations said yes, and they started gobbling up all the little independent media around them.
Exactly. That was my point. And now, okay, on to my second point. I think it was, I know it was during the Obama administration that they pretty well gave carte blanche to you can say anything you want and not be prosecuted for it. You can lie to the people. What law? I've been looking on the internet. The reason I'm coming to you is because I'm looking it up, and I don't know if it's been wiped out or what.
Well, basically, the only laws about telling the truth involve when you're talking to the government. You have to tell the truth to the government. But there are no laws that say corporations have to be truthful with the American people. There are no laws that say politicians have to be truthful. In fact, there have been politicians who've defended.
No, I'm not talking about the politician. I'm talking about the media. Under Obama, they made a law, and I've been looking for it, and evidently it's been wiped clean. And that's why I came to you, because I know you can do this.
Oh, okay.
Put it on your website. There was a law that Obama said that they're not culpable. They're not.
Okay, it wasn't Obama. It wasn't Obama. I know what you're talking about here. This goes back to what was called the Fox News synthetic bovine growth hormone lawsuit. And the story was that Fox News assigned two of their reporters to basically do a puff piece on Monsanto's new synthetic bovine growth hormone. And these reporters went on out and did the story and discovered while they were researching the story that people who were eating the meat and dairy from cows treated with the synthetic bovine growth hormone were suffering a rash of strange medical problems. And so they wrote up the article, and they went back to Fox News, and Fox News said, no, you need to change it. Monsanto's a big advertiser here. And the reporters refused to change it because they thought it was a serious public health concern, and Fox News fired them. These reporters sued Fox News for wrongful termination and lost on appeal when the judge pointed out there is no law that obligates the corporate media to be truthful to the audience. And there never has been. And we point that out.
May I interrupt?
Yeah.
Okay. President Trump is going after the lying media.
Yes.
Okay, I just stated two laws that happen that he needs to repeal, or somebody needs to look at. And anyone in the mainstream media that purpose propaganda that they know is lies, they need to be prosecuted.
Well, that's a very.
I've been looking on the internet. I've been looking on the internet. I've been trying to find.
Can I talk?
What they are? Evidently, they've been erased.
Thomas, let me respond. You're talking about a very slippery slope there, because there are already moves out there to try and pass laws against the independent media for spreading fake news, with the government deciding what is real and what is fake. So even in the case of the corporate media, I don't think we want to go on in there. Obviously, we do have the libel.
I think we need to.
We have the libel and the slander laws to use as weapons. The other weapon is we simply stop watching them, and that's already happening. When we catch the media lying to us over and over and over again, we just change the channel and go someplace else. And corporate news media have lost a huge portion of their audience over the last decade, and those people are coming to the independent media to find out what's going on. And so at some point, their corporate backers are going to start putting away the checkbooks. And those talking heads are going to have to learn how to live without those multi-million-dollar salaries. And we've already got a situation where some of these corporate media outlets have been caught using web bots, botnets, to amplify the clicks on their website to make it look like more people are tuning in. And they're basically defrauding their advertisers in the process. But the way we get rid of dishonest media is we stop paying attention to it. The media got away with it for so long because until the Internet and the independent media, there were no alternate voices out there. I mean, there were a few pirate radio stations and so forth.
No, there is an alternative. Yes, there is an alternative. And it's you and it's me, and that's the reason I called you. And if you can put up on your website these two edicts or laws or whatever you want to call them, you know, where they consolidated the media. And then, under Obama, or I think it was under Obama, that it said that it's okay that you can lie to the people and you will not be prosecuted. That's I think President Trump's talking point right there.
Well, again, Obama had nothing to do with the Fox News synthetic bovine growth hormone lawsuit discussion, but
that's not what I'm talking about.
Okay.
Forget that. I'm not talking about.
Okay, well, I don't know what you're talking about then. I have no idea what you're talking about. Okay?
I'm talking about the mainstream media is lying to the people, and it's legal for them to do it. There's no prosecution for them.
Because there is no law that compels the corporate media to be truthful with the people. That's what the judge ruled.
That's what I'm saying.
Okay, well, we're in agreement on that. We've covered this issue many times before. Anyway, Thomas, thanks a lot for the phone call. We're going to let you go here. Get on back to the news. Getting on back to the economic news, well, actually the news in Europe, and this is somewhat economic. Apparently, the Catalan separatists are now urging their supporters to start pulling cash from ATMs. It was supposed to start this morning. I don't know how effective it's actually been. But apparently, Assemblea Nacional urged supporters to pull cash from CaixaBank and Banco Sabadell branches as a protest against their decision to shift their legal domiciles out of the region. So we'll see what happens there. Now, getting into the realm of political correctness, this is pretty sick. Wyoming man identifies as a transgender woman, has not gone through any hormone treatments or surgery. And this guy, Miguel Martinez, who goes by the name Michelle, identifies as a transgender woman, is now on trial for sexually assaulting a 10-year-old girl in a bathroom. The whole country's going crazy. It's being driven crazy by all this political correctness stuff. All right, we've got time for one quick phone call before the commercial break. Greg in Indiana, aloha. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Hi, Mike. I just wanted to help that guy out. He was talking about the Smith-Mundt Act.
Yeah.
The anti-propaganda. U.S. ends ban on domestic propaganda, RT wrote it up as.
Yeah, well, I thought that might be what he was talking about.
I believe he was speaking of this.
Yeah, well, I thought that might be what he was talking about, but that wasn't just the corporate media. That was the government using propaganda, because previously there had, in fact, been a ban on propaganda used against the American people. So, yeah, and we've talked about this one before as well. Anyway, thank you for the update. Thank you for the information, Greg. We're going to have to let you go. We've got to take a break for commercials, and we will be right back. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show here, and I'm getting a whole bunch of email responding to that question of just who made it legal to lie to the American people. And again, this is not just the corporate media, but the government as a whole. And in addition to the last caller's reference, apparently the NDAA also authorizes the government to lie to the American people. And there's nothing new about it. I'm being sent all these stories going all the way back to the Bush administration, in which they're admitting that, yeah, the government gives the corporate media prepackaged news reports that are run as news. And that's a reality all Americans basically need to be dealing with as they decide whether what they're being shown by that corporate media is real or not. And my opinion is right now you can't trust anything on the corporate media except the sports scores and the weather, and they're not even all that good on the weather. All right, getting on back to the other news here. We're talking about political correctness. We're talking about how our entire society is being driven to insanity with all this PC, Black Lives Matter, retributions for imagined crimes and so forth. And this is a good example of where this is leading. Because apparently, this is an article over an Investment Watch blog, there was a black man reportedly attacked his fellow Maryland Metrobus passenger, a 52-year-old homeless and disabled white man, spitting in the man's face and blaming him for making my grandmother a slave. And so this gentleman, Marquis Evans Royster, 27 years old, attacked this 52-year-old man, saying, "You owe me for making my grandmother a slave." Then he starts going through the guy's pockets. He's just robbing them in view of everyone. And at that point, the other passengers intervened, and he was putting up a fight. And the only thing that stopped it was the bus driver said, "I'm calling the police right now." And so the suspect got off the bus without paying. And the driver reported that Evans Royster referred to all white people as evil and said that 2 white passengers on the bus should die. And apparently on his way out of the bus, he ripped off one of the bus's side view mirrors. Now, there is a little reality that all of these slavery reparations activists need to understand. Just prior to the Civil War, at the peak of slavery in the United States, only 1.5% of the population owned slaves. The vast majority of white people were not, in fact, slave owners. But if you're trying to fan up victimhood in order to turn a certain segment of the society into a political force, details don't really matter. Now, here's another example of where we're going with our society. Apparently, over at Pittsburgh King Pre-K 8 school, there was a teacher, 46-year-old Janice Watkins, and apparently during the class, she tried to confiscate a cell phone from one of the students because the school district has a no cell phone policy. And the student responded by biting the teacher. The parents were called. The parents came on in and basically took the position of, you have no right to take my student's or my child's phone. And apparently the teacher was driving on her way home, sitting in traffic, when the student's mother and another male basically ran up, hit her in the head with a brick, dragged her out of the car, and basically beat her up. Now, this is not in any modern society acceptable behavior. But it's almost like this kind of excess is being sold as a reasonable response to slavery. And again, something you need to remember. Nobody alive today was ever a slave on the antebellum South. Nobody alive today was ever forced to pick cotton. Nobody alive today is a slave owner. This is being fanned up to create divisions within our society so that we do not unite against the real source of all of our poverty and oppression. We'll be right back after these commercials. Now, over at the University of Arizona, they launched a pilot program where students were going to be recruited to be social justice advocates who would be trained to report any bias incidents that occurred in dorms while hosting educational events on social justice issues for residents. And these social justice advocates were trained to report any bias incidents. And, you know, it's like the witch hunts. If you're paid to hunt witches, you'll see witches everywhere. If you're being incentivized to report bias, you'll see bias everywhere. And there was a huge backlash from political commentators saying that the University of Arizona was essentially attempting to turn the entire student body into a bunch of snitches. And the University of Arizona came back and said, all right, well, we're going to redefine and redesign the program and its responsibilities. And then they came on out and said they're just dropping it. They're quitting the whole idea. And political correctness, like any other fad, and that's really what it's been, it does reach a point of ridiculousness, at which point it burns out. And I think we're just about there. Not entirely, and here's a good example. A gentleman by the name of Tim Cox, his nickname is English. It's a nickname since he's had at school, and he added it to his Facebook profile. And Facebook has now banned the word English from his profile, even though he's used it for the last 9 years. And apparently Facebook removed it after a complaint by a member of the public who thinks the word English is racist and non-inclusive. Now, Facebook said it's a violation of its policies to use a fake name, even though there are other profiles that use names such as Osama bin Laden. This is more political correctness. Can't use the word, can't use the E word. It's racist. Now, there's a bit of a media blackout on this. In fact, some of the media is out there already saying this story didn't really happen, that it's fake news. But the story is Jesus Fabian Gonzalez has been arrested for suspicion of arson in Sonoma County, wine country. And Sonoma County is a sanctuary county. And Jesus Fabian Gonzalez is an illegal immigrant. And it's another illustration about how this liberal ideology of open borders and all-inclusiveness wasn't really thought all the way through. Or if it was, that the inevitable negative downsides of the illegal immigrants and the refugees were simply being ignored here in the U.S. for the sake of more Democratic voters. But we continue to see this criminal, violent behavior here in the U.S. and over in Europe, and people are getting tired of it. They're getting tired of being called racist every time they say, we need to control our borders. Because it isn't racism. Illegal isn't a race. Just keep that in mind. We're going to take a phone call. Sean in North Carolina, aloha. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Aloha, Mike. I was going to call you earlier in the week and talk to you about a few things, and I got tied up. And I just noticed on yesterday's show, you had a caller that called in, and he touched on one of the topics I was going to talk to you about, and that was China. It definitely holds water that their water crisis would stop them from being a significant threat to us in a war. I have heard programs from reputable sources, including Dave Hodges, that's done entire programs on the fact about China. The other thing I wanted to discuss with you, I'll go ahead and spit them all out. There's 3 of them, and just listen to what you have to say off the air, is this whole, I know you're having fun with this Weinstein thing, But my concern is, they're going to take him down. They've taken Bill Cosby down. I think there's a plot behind this when everybody, agrees that these people should be brought down, rightly so, for the things they've done, that it's all going to lead to Donald Trump. Oh, now that we've taken in, everybody agrees, now we have to look at Donald Trump and what he's done.
Hillary's already saying that. Hillary's already out there trying to draw a parallel between Harvey Weinstein and Donald Trump, and every time somebody says, isn't it a closer link to Bill Clinton, and she says, oh, that happened so long ago. Your people are so petty.
Yeah, as soon as this come out, that's the first, I almost seen right through it. I said, this is their... Because, face it, everything that's on the corporate media, just your local news, everything that you see now is geared toward attacking Donald Trump. Everything, your entire news broadcast. I don't care if it's the weather, the hurricanes. Oh, well, let's put it on Donald Trump. Sports, the NFL, let's attack Donald Trump. Everything's geared toward attacking him.
I agree.
And lastly, the last comment I wanted to is people call in that want to talk about a violent uprising in the country, and multiple people have brought it up on your show, and you've always said, you don't want that to happen because the one thing that the United States is good at is killing people. I kind of disagree with that, because the United States, while we're good at killing people, we're good at killing unarmed people. We're good at blowing up aspirin factories and hitting civilians. This country is scared to death of anybody that's armed. I think, they're scared to death of us. They won't make a move until they've got these guns.
Well, they're making the move on the guns right now.
That's why it might be time to act before they get taken away.
Well, I'll be very...
all the way back to Vietnam, they beat us with booby traps.
I'll be very honest with you that I think a move to confiscate all guns might trigger a violent uprising.
I agree with you. I do agree with that. I don't think that I don't think it would tip in the government's favor if that happened. A lot of people say, they've purged the military. They've purged higher ups in the military, because if you think about it, if they send military troops out on the street, they're not going to agree to do that, because the biggest deterrent from that is they have families that live in this country too.
Yes.
And if those families of theirs are armed, they're going to have the threat of other soldiers coming in. They're going to be with their homes protecting their families. They're not going to follow any order like that. They would need They would either need foreign mercenaries or some kind of foreign army to come in here to do that.
Well, they certainly have enough Muslims here now to create a new army that would have no love for the American people. But you're right. The ordinary rank-and-file military are probably not interested in going along with a military coup d'etat of the United States. And several years ago, there was this test called the Combat Arms Survey that was done on the U.S. Marines who are exempt from posse comitatus. And I had a friend, business associate, that had been a Marine at 29 Palms when the test was being done. And he confided that the Marines all said, yes, they would confiscate guns from the American people. They would kill Americans who resisted, because the officers made it clear that's the answer that they wanted on this combat arms survey. But he said the reality is that hardly anybody in his group of Marines really thought that. They were just doing as they were told. And going on back to this USS Shane, the leaks coming out of there about how demoralized those Navy crewmen are, it is doubtful that the U.S. Could marshal an effective fighting force against the American people. Look how much trouble they're having just in the wars they've got now. Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, the whole thing. So it's problematic. I just don't want to take that chance right now. And I don't think the American people are really at that stage yet where they would welcome this idea of a violent revolution. I still think our best option is to stay calm and watch our government implode, because it's doing it right now. We're on our way to a Soviet Union-style collapse of our central government with all this scandal about Uranium-1 coming out, the economy about ready to take a huge plunge. I think it's coming apart. And we don't want to give the government any excuses to just say, all right, it's a national emergency, martial law, no more Constitution, and then things really would get worse. Now, I may be wrong, but I do not like this idea of a military violent revolution in the streets. I'm concerned that our government may start one in order to put it down. And that may be what all this Black Lives Matter, convincing the black people to be violent, is really all about.
Yeah, I agree with that. I don't think the people are ready for that kind of revolution yet. But we're still in the phases, and, you know, the people are still in the process of waking up, and it's happening on a large scale. And that's usually the step that happens before you become ready for a violent revolution. But the thing that worries me is the United States, as you say, they're crumbling and they're getting desperate, and they keep pushing harder and harder to get these guns and everything. And it might come to a point where that's the only option that you have, either that or lose everything. And at that point, you know, I think it would be better to rise up before letting them come in and just wipe the nation of guns.
Well, as I said before,
or they just, because they are making a push to do, you know, to do what they can before they fall. You know, they want our guns, and, you know, I'm afraid we're going to have other false flags. They didn't get it with this Las Vegas thing, and who knows what's around the corner. But they're pushing, you know.
They sure botched Las Vegas.
Every step that they take forward, they're going to do something bigger and bigger.
Yeah, I'm afraid you're absolutely right on that one. But the question is, the American people aren't buying these false flags anymore. The poll numbers are not showing that people are buying it. Las Vegas, every day goes by, more and more of the survivors who were actually there are coming out and saying, yes, there were multiple shooters. And now apparently there's a video of a shooter up on one of the billboards, and it's falling apart. And we have literally they're trying to lock down the hotels. One of the survivors has filed a lawsuit against the Mandalay Bay, and the judge has ordered the preservation of all evidence. It may be a little too late for that. But every time they do another one of these false flags and we rip it to pieces here on the independent media, the American public comes to understand, yes, this government rules us through lies, fraud, and deception. As far as China and its water is concerned, I would think that some nation somewhere is going to make it a high priority, worthy of a Manhattan-style project with serious investment in engineering, to provide low-cost, high-volume water filtration, desalinization. And there's a lot of interesting technologies out there, but of course, from the corporate mind, it's much more reliable and cheaper to suck what fresh water is left out of the earth, put it in a bottle, and sell it in the store. But when that starts to run out, I think there will be alternative technologies that become available. Just like as the oil and gas runs out, they'll start looking at other technologies like thorium cycle reactors, for example.
Well, until that happens, I don't know. Maybe that's the United States plan. Maybe that's what this North Korea thing. Let's get in there and hit them while we can, while we have a barrel over their head. I have no idea, but
well, I think
if that does come and they can provide themselves with sufficient fresh water, then yes, then they are a force to be feared.
Well, North Korea just.
But I know that with the crisis that they got going on now, that would severely hamper their military efforts in a major war.
You're talking about China or North Korea?
China.
Yeah. Okay, Sean, we're going to let you go. We're running out of time here, and
thanks, Mike.
All right, we're going to take one more phone call here. James in Texas, aloha. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Yes. Can you hear me, Mike?
I hear you just fine.
Yes. What I wanted to tell you about is the North Korea thing. All these false flags. Everybody should know who it helps is Israel. And I want to get something that I want to tell you. If you go to this if you go to Dixon, Texas, and it's about the Hurricane Harvey relief. And there's a grant in there that you can get and apply. But the interesting thing is, on number 11, it says verification not to boycott Israel. By executing this agreement below, the application verifies that the applicant does not boycott Israel and will not boycott Israel during the terms of this agreement. Now, this is going on to all the places that were affected by Harvey and Irma.
Yes.
Now, you tell me this. Why does our United States tell us to make it illegal to boycott Israel, but yet they're telling us to boycott our own NFL, our own American brands like the NFL and NRA? And then, at the same time, they make us go after countries like Iran, who they say there's a threat to them, and North Korea, who just talks about, because see, North Korea, they want nukes because they were saying, well, Israel got their nukes.
All right, well,
nobody talks about that.
James, you're kind of meandering. I want to go back to your original point, and you raise a good one. Why are all these cities in Texas including a no boycott of Israel clause in the applications for aid to rebuild their homes? And it's already provoked a huge, huge backlash and a huge amount of anger. It's already been denounced as completely unconstitutional. And I think the people of Texas need to find out just whose bright idea this was and make sure that they are given the pink slip next election, because it is wholly inappropriate.
Governor Abbott wrote it in.
Governor Abbott wrote it in? Well, friends in Texas, Abbott needs to go.
Like, yeah. If you're not friends of Israel, you're not friend of Texas, or something like that. And like anybody who's offering a grant or something, that they basically, if you're involved in that, you're not going to get any assistance of anything. That's any type of state assistance.
That is wholly inappropriate for a state governor to be doing, because his first responsibility, his first allegiance and loyalty is to the people of his state. And talk about an obvious sellout and an obvious puppet. And a reminder, we live under puppet rule, foreign puppet rule. Anyway, James, I'm going to have to let you go. Got to take a break for commercials, and we'll be back with another phone call. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. We're going to take one more phone call here, and that's Don in Iowa. Aloha, Don. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Hello, Mike. Yes, you're talking a lot about people just hurl out the insult racist. It doesn't have to mean anything. It's just a word they throw out.
Well, it's the same tactic that the Israelis use when they scream anti-Semite, when they can't win an argument through facts, logic, and law.
Well, this guy, Mark Faber, are you familiar with Mark Faber? He's a gold bug.
Yes.
He's lives in Thailand. They got him. He just a couple of days ago, he had a interview with Business Insider, and he said, "Thank God white people populated America and not the blacks." And he says, "Otherwise, it might look like Zimbabwe." But this guy is a great guy. For years they've had him on these business shows like CNBC and Bloomberg, and they'll put him on because he's a charming, witty guy, and he'll sit there and he'll present the contrary view to what they're normally trying to say. They're normally trying to be cheerleaders. The stock market will go up forever and all that. And they call this guy Dr. Doom, Mark Faber. But now he's 71 years old. He's probably ready to say hell with it anyway and retire. But I'm sure when he made this remark, he knew this stuff would happen to him. But they kicked him off all the boards he was on, boards of directors, and then they say they're not going to have him anymore on TV.
Well, I mean, I understand what he's saying, but it probably could have been phrased a little bit more politely. And, the issue here, though, is when they talk about nations with different ethnic populations, there's a reality everybody needs to look at. Europe is the way it is because it was built by the Europeans. Africa is the way it is because it was built by the Africans. And this idea that the fact that Africans don't have a European-style culture, it represents some form of oppression, is nonsense. We are all living in the cultures and societies that we collectively work together to produce. And it's not racist to point on out that, yes, there are differences in our cultures and our societies because we engineered it that way. Anyway, listen, Don, I need to let you go. I'm going to squeeze in one more phone call before the top. Dave in Missouri, aloha. What's on your mind?
Hey, howdy, aloha, Mike. Talked to you yesterday. How's your day, brother?
So far, so good. We're short on time. What's on your mind?
Well, I wanted to kind of finish up, and so so we discussed yesterday how Walmart purchased both political parties to achieve retail monopoly, and then used those political influences to advance a free trade agenda, emptying our factories out, destroying the middle class, transferring the wealth to communist China. So this is where I wanted to follow up. I kind of meant to get there yesterday, but this is a big topic. It's hard to really discuss in a short amount of time. So
well, unfortunately, Dave, I'll tell you what. Dave, call into the show on Monday, just when we're starting one of the big segments, and I'll let you talk. But we'd have to do station identification, and then it's the Lady Claire. We'll be right back. And aloha, America. Welcome back to our show, hour number 3. And if you're watching on BAM User, this gorgeous creature sitting next to me is the lovely Lady Claire, who likes to join us on our Friday third hours with her unique perspective on the world. And so take it away.
Yes.
Oops, I'm sorry. Helps if I turn up your volume.
Okay, thank you, dear.
Yes, professional radio here, along with all the other problems we had this week.
Yeah, Steve Lendman had a very sober article in Global Research, which is a Canadian pro-truth, pro-justice blog. And he talks about Nikki Haley's anti-Iranian rage, prelude to war. And he described her as Trump's leading administration antagonist, notably on North Korea and Iran.
And Russia.
The whole enchilada. And China. Her hostile early September address on the Islamic Republic before the hawkish American Enterprise Institute preceded Trump's decertification of the JCPOA nuclear deal, an international treaty the president defied by his action. Haley's address was a deplorable litany of beginning-to-end lies, and on Wednesday, during a Security Council open debate on the Middle East, she was at it again. And Lendman says her remarks included a long laundry list of long-ago discredited canards. Washington, Israel, and its sinister AIPAC lobby resent Iranian sovereign independence, its military strength solely for defense, an obstacle to Israeli regional dominance, along with America's presence. And he asked the question, were Haley's hostile Wednesday remarks a prelude for initiating diabolical Trump administration plans ahead, including naked aggressive against the country, nuclear deals decertification, and a starter for what's to come? Now, Mike, as I look at Nikki Haley, I think that probably her strongest qualifications for the job of, I'm just going to say it out loud, bimbo ambassador at the UN representing the United States, were two things. Her unwavering slavish affection for Israel, allowing her to believe that this country can do absolutely no wrong, and an absolute, nearly pathological inability to look at facts and make intelligent conclusions from a review of those facts.
Well, you need to understand that politicians, like TV news reporters, have to be able to stand there with their hair on fire and insist they smell no smoke.
No smoke, yeah.
And do it convincingly. And that's Nikki Haley's job. And obviously the fact that Trump has not yanked at her leash, she is in fact reflective of administration policy.
Yep.
And the most recent one, of course, we talked about earlier in the program, is she's out there saying that Russia's meddling in our election was an act of war. Ignoring the fact that there's no evidence of Russian meddling in last year's election.
Yeah.
All the election fraud found so far points to the Hillary Clinton people.
Yep.
And the head of the CIA has come on out and said if there was any Russian meddling, it wouldn't have had any effect. It was if it's too small to see, it's too small to have any effect. But again, Nikki Haley's job is to go on up there and just repeat the same official lies because that is the official reality. And, if you're not loyal to the official reality, then you are of no use whatsoever to the government.
Yeah. But, it's such a shame. I wish we had someone in this administration who could stand up to President Trump when he is wrong, sit him down and say, President Trump, on this particular issue, I really think a rethink is necessary.
Well,
and I'll go
I
to
agree.
another example of that a little bit later in some of the things I'm talking about. Apparently, Israeli forces have ransacked and shut down Palestinian media companies. They did this at pre-dawn time Wednesday, shut down and ransacked the head of a Palestinian media production company, citing incitement reasons during raids in Ramallah, Nablus, Al-Khalil, and Bethlehem in the West Bank. And apparently they went in like, a storming army to the headquarters of Transmedia, Palmedia, and Ramsat news agencies. And before they seized their equipment, the army shut down the offices of Transmedia and Palmedia for 6 months under a military order. And they sealed off the building with red wax and metal plates. Guys, maybe a little excessive.
Well, the red wax or wax seals to
Yeah.
make sure
No
nobody's
one
gone
opens
back,
it. Yeah.
Yeah, gone back in there. But this of course, was also the broadcaster carrying Russia Today
Yeah.
into Israel. And we're seeing this open warfare on Russia Today,
Mhm.
not just in Israel, but here in the United States of America.
Oh, yeah.
There was a very alarming story where the former head of the FCC is out there saying that there has to be a law where anybody who simply forwards anything declared by the government to be fake news can be sued for libel.
Yes, President or Professor Rivero, I'd like to talk about her a little bit later on in the show.
Good.
And, the only thing I can think in terms of this Israeli raid and this complete overreaction to shut down the Palestinian Free Press, because was it possibly speaking the truth about occupation in Palestinian lands, which always, in the Israeli view, counts as incitement?
Well,
tell the truth, it's incitement. Tell
exactly
the truth,
right.
it's anti-Semitic.
That's
et cetera,
exactly
et cetera.
right. In this country right now, I need to borrow this for just a second. We're going to do a shout out to our on-air affiliates who are just now rejoining our network, and it's all yours again.
Thank you.
Here in the United States, if you speak the truth about what the government is doing, you're declared to be an arm of Russian propaganda. Say that arm, big meaty arm there. I'm an arm of Russian propaganda.
No, I think that American truth tellers need right now, the timing is critical, to band together and not allow the government narratives, which are always placed out with the prostitutes, to create the environment and the atmosphere to move an agenda forward. Apparently the CIA chief was saying that North Korea is on the cusp of the ability to hit the U.S. with nukes. Pompeo warned that North Korea's progress is so quick right now that there's no way to predict when they'll succeed, adding, you're now talking about months, and that a detailed level of precision is irrelevant.
Well, sounds like a really good reason to leave North Korea alone then, doesn't it?
Yeah, and now this is something I'm aware of. The huge war exercises between South Korea and the U.S. have theoretically ended as of today, with the dateline yesterday, Thursday, our time. So what happens when these military resources just leave the Korean Peninsula for a while? Now, every day, I go to 38north.org, which is a highly respected organization under the auspices of Johns Hopkins University, and there has been nothing in recent articles about the North Koreans having moved any of their missiles to a launch site for a test. So, Mike, this is what I'm thinking. I think that Kim Jong-un won't do anything more with his missiles until his nuclear scientists are absolutely sure that they can have a missile and a payload which can actually hit the U.S. East Coast. At that point, he might be ready to negotiate with the United States, but from a position of strength.
Well, North Korea actually came out and said that just yesterday, that they're not interested in negotiations until they're in a position of parity. And that is that they will respond to threats of nuclear attack from the United States with their own threats of nuclear retaliation, mutually assured destruction. And that's the whole point of the missiles and the nuclear bombs, is a credible deterrent to deter aggression. Because, again, if you go back and you look over the last 16 years, starting with Afghanistan, what is the nation that's actually doing the invading, the drone striking, the regime changing, the coup d'etat? It's the United States of America. And any nation, whether it's North Korea or Iran or anybody, has a reasonable expectation that they'd better build up their defenses and create a deterrent, or sooner or later, the U.S. war machine will be coming for them and their natural resources. It's just common sense. And I don't blame North Korea for wanting a nuclear deterrent to keep the peace. I don't blame Iran if they should decide that they need a nuclear deterrent to keep the peace. I mean, if you look very carefully, the United States has never actually attacked a nation that has a nuclear deterrent. They only attack small, helpless, weak nations. And with all this talk about nuclear this and nuclear that, let us not lose sight of the fact that only one nation on Earth has ever actually used nuclear weapons of mass destruction against the civilians of another country, and that is the United States of America.
Or as I'm referring to it now, the unhinged, surveilled states of America. And the unhinging is something that I'm really seeing.
Yeah, that hinge is about worn out there.
Yeah, and it's interesting because most of you know that my day job, I do marketing. But even if people don't understand intellectually what is going on right now with the way that the U.S. is pushing at various foreign governments and you know, going into making some very bad decisions, they hear it emotionally. And many times the people on the other end of the line, and my job is to be as gentle and friendly as I can, there's not a whole lot of gentle and friendliness that I'm hearing coming back to me.
It's not just on the phones here. I mean, around Oahu. When we first moved here, it really was very Hawaiian. Everybody was relaxed. Everybody drove slowly, and nobody was in a rush to get anywhere. And of late, we're seeing more and more incidents of road rage. And people just sullen and hostile, and we know that the economic hardships are a big part of it. But there are a lot of people concerned on this island that if the U.S. provokes a real shooting war with North Korea, with Russia, with China, we are inevitably a target on this rock.
Yeah, because all the comms come through here toward Asia, right?
All the communication hub for the entire Pacific is on Oahu, and yes, they have satellite bypasses and everything, but we're still a target. Commander of the Pacific Fleet is here. All the command facilities are here. We would be a target.
Yeah. I'd like to bop over now to Syria. And this has been kind of a Pyrrhic victory, if you will, for the United States Special Forces in Raqqa. Apparently more than 1,800 civilians have been killed overall in the defeat of ISIS at Raqqa. And the U.S.-backed Democratic Syrian forces have announced the capture of Raqqa from so-called Islamist State fighters, while coalition officials say that there are still small pockets of resistance. It is now possible to assess the significant civilian toll of the 4-month battle. Apparently, some 200,000 civilians, by some estimates, were in the city when operations to dislodge ISIS began on June 6th. Through the SDF and coalition appeared at times to give conflicting instructions to civilians, most were able to flee, including several thousand during the last week of the fighting, following an agreement that also saw the surrender and evacuation of about 275 ISIS fighters. You know, and this strikes me because I remember with President Trump's campaign, he promised not only to kill ISIS, but their families, their children, their wives, their aunties, their uncles. And we can see how this has been demonstrated in this very huge number of casualties in Raqqa, where, by the way, and I'd like to remind our audiences about this, the U.S. has never been invited by the Syrian government to fight ISIS, but became instead an enabler for proxy jihadists.
See, the scam is very, very simple. The U.S. sent ISIS into Syria because they needed an excuse to keep attacking Syria when that nonsense about Assad gassing his own people fell apart. And now they're looking for a new way to stay in there. They're not invited. Somebody actually put up a drone video taking over Raqqa. That city is smashed. It's absolutely ruined.
It's rubble. It's rubble right now.
Reminds me of that old cliche from Vietnam. We had to destroy the village to save it.
I remember that, and it left a very bitter taste in my mouth then, and it does at 68 now. I would like to bop over to Afghanistan for what is going on here. And apparently, this has been like a string of things that has happened. The Taliban has destroyed an Afghan army base in Kandahar. A major Taliban attack in Afghan's Kandahar province has resulted in the destruction of the whole enchilada, Afghan army base and the deaths of at least 58 Afghan soldiers. The toll is expected to rise with other wounded and 6 missing. The attacks began when the Taliban started detonating 2 armored vehicles full of explosives, causing massive damage. Other Taliban swooped into the base and destroyed everything that was left. And on the promise of anonymity, there was a statement made. Unfortunately, there is nothing left inside the camp, the Afghan Defense Ministry confirmed. They have burned down everything they found inside. This is the latest of several major attacks on Afghan security forces in the last few days. Now, I've got a question for SecDef Mathis. A word, please. If the current U.S. NATO surge is working, why, please, are these Taliban attacks escalating by the day? It doesn't make logical sense. I'm no military tactician, but just logically, if the improved numbers of U.S. and NATO are surging, but it's not holding back these attacks, what good
No,
is
it's
it?
just angering the Afghan people.
Yeah.
They're very tough. I mean, there's a reason Afghanistan is called the graveyard of empires. The last military commander to completely conquer Afghanistan and hang on to it was Alexander the Great.
Right.
And he only kept it for 3 years.
Yeah.
Now, what's going on in Afghanistan is the same thing that's going on in Syria. The U.S. is losing, but they don't want to admit that they're losing. They don't want to appear to be losing, so they're going to keep on pouring more of your children into Syria and Afghanistan on flimsier and flimsier pretexts.
Yeah.
And they don't care how many of your kids get killed, as long as they can say, the war isn't over, we're still in there, we can still be victorious.
Yeah, and Mike, wise presidential leadership with any small grasp of the history of this part of the world would have never made the mistake of engaging Afghan militarily in a heartbeat.
Well, I've got to tell you, Putin's got to be laughing his head off
Oh,
over this
sure.
because this was the trap the Soviet Union fell into, and it was the Soviet Union's defeat in Afghanistan which began the downfall of the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
Because the world realized the Soviet military wasn't invincible. They could be defeated by, the Mujahideen, yes, covertly armed with weapons by the United States government. But that was the beginning of the end for the Soviet Union. And it'll be the same thing here. If the Taliban can drive the puppet regime out of Afghanistan, if Iraq can drive the Americans out of Iraq, if Assad can get the Americans out of Syria, it will be the beginning of the end.
Yeah.
America's military might will be seen as a hollowed-out shell, an illusion. And again, going back to what we're hearing coming out of the U.S. Navy ships, there's clearly a morale and training and command problem completely through the ranks.
Yeah. And when I talked about wisdom and 2001, what we had in the White House was the most horrifically polar opposite from wisdom. Feebly intellectual in the person of one George W. Bush, scion of a wealthy Texas oil family, which believed, as a matter of personal dogma, that it had a divine right to rule the White House via the second most criminal and skewed history in America's history.
Yep.
If you haven't seen the film Recall, please do it. Now, adept speechwriters and highly scripted photo ops could only barely mask the innate lack of intelligence this guy had. So he was, I think, very easily railroaded into military misadventures, which had absolutely no chance to be successful either in the short run or the long run. Now, his unholy enablers, Cheney and Rumsfeld, cheerled the idea when the money the Taliban wanted for use of their pipelines was far more than American oil companies were willing to pay, plus you had the issue of instability in the country. So the result of the invasion and occupation of Afghanistan has been a colossal strategic failure bought at catastrophic cost in American blood and money. Now, SecDef Mattis, you are a very respected military professional. You are highly respected, and in fact, sometimes the word revered is used by people who have served under you. You and President's team have been agitated about what the international community may think about the U.S. and NATO leaving Afghanistan. But, sir, I think it's time for you and President Trump to pay just a little attention, please, to the folks who worked against all odds to put your boss into the White House. Now, Mike and I count ourselves as two of those people. So what I'm asking here of SecDef Mathis, it is logical after 16 years on to have U.S. and NATO troops evacuate the country as quickly, as safely as possible, then negotiate with whatever government is left standing in Kabul for the pipeline and mineral rights.
Don't forget the opium. All right, we got to take a break for commercials. We'll be right back. Aloha, America. Welcome back to the show here. And Claire, this was the story. It's FEC, not FCC, but please share with us.
Yeah. Former Federal Election Committee chair demands Internet disinformation crackdown in major threat to free speech. In one of the most reckless and chilling attacks on free speech, the former chair of the Federal Election Committee and Berkeley lecturer Anne Revelle is pushing for a federal crackdown on disinformation on the Internet. And it's a term that she doesn't really want to define very much. Revelle is pushing a proposal that she laid out in a paper co-authored with Abby Wood, an associate professor of the University of Southern California, and Irina Dunkenny, a student at USC Gould School of Law. To combat fake news, Revelle and her co-authors would undermine the use of the Internet as a forum for free speech. The regulation would include the targeting of people who share stories deemed fake or disinformation by government regulators. My dear Dr. Revelle, you've just shown your hand as to whom you work, to whom you report, and by whom you get paid. The irony is that such figures are decrying Russian interference with our system and responding by curtailing free speech, something Vlad Putin would certainly applaud. No, he wouldn't.
No, he wouldn't.
When telling the truth becomes a criminal act, and most government officials behave as criminals, in order to protect their wealth and their station, what happens to the country as a whole?
We become a dictatorship.
Yeah, and we're nearly at that tipping point right the darned heck now.
Yes, we are.
Now, Revelle is frightened, and justifiably so, at so much coming out at this point that the elites are unable to put the genie back in the bottle, like the fact that Hillary Clinton took bribes to get the Uranium One deal done with Russia, the fact that Hillary's Clintonistas stole the Democratic primary from Bernie Sanders, the facts that U.S.-enabled Saudi military is guilty of war crimes in the slaughter of innocents in Yemen, and that President Bush lied the American people into 2 wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, not because the American people were in any danger, but to control the oil, pipeline, and mineral resources in those countries.
And the opium.
Yeah, well, that too. These alleged government regulators, in which he's willing to put so much trust, will always lie to the American people, Mike, to further the deep state's agenda. And that agenda generally goes something like this. Create a false narrative. Demonize the country the U.S. wants to regime change and from which it wants to expropriate resources to which it really has no moral right. Regime change, make sure the government in place after the coup is much more Western-centric, then ensure that those resources are expropriated and only sold with American permission and for American dollars. Now, we have seen this pattern, Mike, in Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, and Somalia. We don't want to hear the lies one more time, Dr. Revelle. Thank you very much. And in looking at Dr. Revelle's proposal on this, I just have to wonder, Mike, how much of her portfolio is represented by the military-industrial complex, the guys who make the bombs and the bullets, because that's ultimately what happens before the regime change comes. There is and are physical attacks. Now, it would seem to me, and I think you'd agree with me on this, is actually the job these days of the occupied, unhinged, surveilled states of America's governments in the 21st century to create narratives to forward their agendas, which right now looks like conquering the entire world one bit at a time and controlling all of its resources in sort of a slow-mo Pac-Man style, but using real bombs and bullets to accomplish its ends. Mike, what do you think?
Well, in the version of the article I read, she gave one of her motivations for wanting to do this is to restore voter confidence, which which tells me that basically the issue is that the government is finally realizing the American people don't trust them, don't believe them. We are aware that our election system is an absolute joke.
Yeah.
And the only way they can sort of reassert the red pill on us all is to find some way to silence the independent media. They're going to have to find some kind of way to get around that pesky First Amendment.
Yep.
Okay. We're going to take another break for commercials, and I'll be right back. Will do. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. And before we go back to Claire, we're just noticing on the corporate media, they're regurgitating Malaysian Airlines Flight 370, the one that disappeared somewhere over the Indian Ocean, somewhere in that region. They're recycling that one. And again, it's like we do have more immediate pressing things to be talking about, like the Uranium One deal. Now, to give Fox News credit, they are the only corporate media out there that are reporting on any of the aspects of this story. The rest of the corporate media, it's just absolute silence, and they're shrugging their shoulders and saying, well, we gave this 92 seconds 2 years ago. It's not current events anymore. And again, they're still obsessing over Donald Trump's phone call to the Gold Star widow, trying to make something out of that. But she released the entire tape of the phone call, and it was very respectful. Again, it's another big nothing burger. And that's what the corporate media is there to do. Feed you nothing burgers so that you're not paying attention to what's really going on. Like we said before, it caught a lot of people by surprise. We have troops in Niger? We didn't even know. So, anyway, getting on back to your talking points.
Okay. The Catalonian crisis is getting uglier very quickly. Spain is moving to suspend Catalan's autonomy. As of tomorrow, as the region's leader threatens to declare independence, the government said ministers would meet to activate Article 155 of the Spanish Constitution, allowing it to take over the region's running. Catalonian leaders said that the region's parliaments would vote on independence if Spain continued repression. A repression outlawed by Spain was held earlier this month.
A referendum outlawed by Spain.
Referendum, yes. Of the 43% who voted, 91% of independence. There is some fear that the latest moves could spark further unrest after mass demonstrations before and since the ballot on 1 November. And Spain's Supreme Court has declared the vote illegal and said that it violated the Constitution, which describes the country as indivisible. Article 155 of their Constitution, which cemented democratic rule 3 years after the death of Franco in 1975, allows Madrid to impose direct rule in a crisis, but it's never been invoked. Now, Mike, my take on this is that Spanish Prime Minister Rajoy seems kind of heck-bent on creating a second civil war in Spain. And so one has to really ask, are NATO troops going to be sent to Catalonia under the guise of peacekeepers?
I would say in all probability that would be yes.
Yeah.
Because anybody breaking free now is a threat to the globalist agenda.
Yeah.
The globalist agenda is in serious trouble right now, and they're fighting back as hard as they can. Soros apparently just poured another $18 billion with a B into his Open Society Foundation. So they're going to be putting pedal to the metal, trying to push this open borders, get the refugees blended on in, drop the borders, and bring about the New World Order as hard as they can.
Yeah.
And the harder they push, the harder people are pushing back. But, you know, the other day, Vladimir Putin made a very cogent observation. He said NATO only has itself to blame for all this talk about secession all across Europe because of their support of Kosovo independence. And again, it underscores the double standards and hypocrisy of the NATO nations and the United States in that, let's get Kosovo broken free. They have a right to be independent, and all these other countries do not. Well, the reason was Kosovo had all these mines, especially the Trepka lead mines that were formerly under somebody else's control, and then they were brought into Western U.S. control. And so that's really what it's all about. They're fine for areas breaking off independence if they're coming their way with a lot of wealth. And they're absolutely opposed to anybody fighting for independence who might be tending to go the other direction toward Russia or China.
Like Crimea.
Like Crimea.
But the thing that Prime Minister Rajoy seems to be utterly ignoring are the optics of such a move, and this is why. Spain is a signatory to the UN Charter, and in the UN Charter is enshrined the right to peaceful self-determination. And so if one is a signatory to the UN Charter, one says, okay, people have the right to peaceful self-determination.
But the only way the UN would actually enforce that is through a Security Council resolution where the U.S. would stand up and go veto.
Yeah. But the one question I think that Spanish Prime Minister Rajoy has not asked is if he is determined to suppress the heretofore generally peaceful Catalonian independence movement, does that not compel Spain to do a Sprexit from the UN on this issue? And I'm asking the Prime Minister of Spain, hey, think it through, think it through.
It doesn't compel Spain to do anything. I mean, we're living in an age right now where governments just do what they want to do. And the only thing that's really changed is they've lost the ability to convince their populations that what they're doing is right, moral, just, and legal. That's because the corporate media all around the globe has lost their credibility in the age of the Internet. And that's why you have people like Rivero out there saying, we've got to shut it down. We can't rule you effectively if we can't lie to you. If we can't commit frauds on you and false flags, then how are we going to run a country? Well, it is possible to run a country without lies, fraud, and deception. Certainly they were doing a good job of it in this country back in the late 1700s. But the problem is our current generation of politicians have gotten away with ruling the country with lies, fraud, and deception for so long, they've actually forgotten any other way to run the nation. And what we have here, I call it the narcocracy, it is an openly criminal government. And now we're seeing the repressive measures start to become public. Like I said, we've got this coffee mug over at our store that we sell, and it says on the front of it, the fastest way to bring down a dictatorship is to force it to act like one where everybody can see it, and that's what's happening right now. Because this suggestion by Rivero about government-approved moderators decide what is real and what is fake news, and anybody carrying the fake news gets sued, that's provoked a tremendous backlash. And again, it is completely unconstitutional.
And it shows you who she actually is working for, the deep state of America.
More importantly, it shows who they're afraid of.
Yes. And unfortunately, people like Mike and me are people that they are afraid of.
Well, they're afraid of all the American people now who refuse to drink the Kool-Aid.
Right. Today is a very unfortunate anniversary. 6 years ago today, the U.S. helped murder Gaddafi in Libya to stop the creation of a gold-backed currency. And the West took it upon itself to use NATO to overthrow Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi, not for any humanitarian threat to their civilians, as has repeatedly been claimed, but because his planned rollout of a new currency to be used across Africa posed a palpable existential threat to central banks at the heart of the Western financial and political system. Long theorized to be the actual vehicle for Gaddafi's downfall, the gold-backed dinar-based Pan-African currency motive came to light in nascent 2016 in one of more than 3,000 of Hillary Clinton's emails released by the State Department, conveniently timed with the New Year's holiday to abate outrage or repercussions.
Well, it didn't work because we reported on it on our New Year's show.
And I remember what she said about his execution, which was, I can't even begin to describe it on the radio because it is so physically, horrifically brutal. But what she said was, we came, we saw, he died, thus cackled Clinton upon hearing Gaddafi's execution.
Yeah, it was that cackle that was very unnerving. She actually thought this was a cool thing. She enjoys murdering
she kind of
death.
got off on it,
I mean, look at that long trail of dead bodies behind the Clintons. I mean, I'm sure she had orgasms for every one of those things.
And we can see now.
Oh, we whacked Vince Foster.
And we can see now just how stabilizing that action has been for Libya, now factionalized in a bloody civil war, which is still tearing the country apart 6 years on.
But we did make the world safe for fiat currencies and private central banking by getting rid of that gold dinar.
Amen, amen.
And the gold that was to go in the gold dinar, nobody knows where that went. That disappeared.
Disappeared, huh? Okay.
Yep.
Apparently, there are some numbers that have been put together. President Trump has killed more civilians with illegal drone strikes in 9 months than Obama did in 8 years. And while the mainstream media focuses on anything but the current state of the U.S. intervention in the Middle East, the Trump administration is breaking records by accumulating an horrific number of civilian deaths. Now, former President Obama earned the nickname of Drone King when he dramatically escalated the use of drone strikes while also downplaying the number of innocent civilians who became collateral damage. In the 2 years that his administration devoted to publicly spending millions of dollars to fight the Islamic State group, the estimated civilian death tolls range from 2,300 to 3,400, according to Air Wars, an organization tracking deaths in the war against ISIS. President Trump has been in office for just 9 months, and he has already surpassed Obama's murderous record with an estimated numbers as high as 4,500 civilian deaths. He likes large numbers. I'm sure he's probably not upset with this. And in looking at all this, Mike, and looking at the big picture and kind of sitting back, it appears to me that this alleged war on terror is simply an excuse to commit genocide wherever American troops are stationed, which causes those to survive to become radicalized and repeat the cycle all over again to ensure that the U.S.'s perpetual waging of war on societies that have the bad taste to be living over resources those in the bowels of power in D.C. have decided the U.S. needs to expropriate in such a way. And this money never trickles down to the people who live over these resources.
No, they don't. That's why they hated Hugo Chavez so much, because Hugo Chavez's attitude was the people of Venezuela jointly owned Venezuela's oil. And when the oil was being sold, Chavez would spend that money on the Venezuelan people. And that's just setting a bad example for the rest of the world. All the people in these other countries might get this uppity idea that government is supposed to spend their money on the people rather than themselves. And that's why Chavez had to go, and now they're after Maduro.
Maduro, yeah.
And that's really what it's all about. I mean, the New World Order is inherently fascistic. And under fascism, ordinary people don't have any money. It's all piled up at the top.
Yep. And, you know, I think you and I have discussed this before, but there's no 16-year-old kid in this country who has never seen this country not at a permanent state of war against somebody.
Well, I'm looking back over my 65 years and trying to remember, was there a time when our country wasn't at war then? Especially when you look at the covert interventions, which we now know took place, it seems like the U.S. has been at war with somebody for every year that I've been alive.
Yeah, I'm feeling that also. And by the way, dear, the U.S. military has assured us very publicly that these wars are going to get worse and soon. And why do I know that? There is an article that has been put out by the DoD, and it says, U.S. military is preparing for decades of hybrid wars. Note the plural. And were I a betting woman, I would bet on this, that at some point during the Trump administration, the draft is going to be reintroduced in this country, and this time, the military will be coming both for your sons and your daughters.
Well, that issue about the daughters has gone back and forth, whether they can be drafted into combat roles or should they be drafted into non-combat roles. Certainly, starting a draft is going to provoke a huge negative reaction, but I am hearing word that apparently there's already some committee in Congress that is now actively debating how this can be brought about.
That doesn't surprise me. The U.S. for quite some time has not conscripted. Russia conscripts and China conscripts, you know. So we don't have that force of troops. We are also, the U.S. military is very much hammered by not having equipment that gets out there and performs the way it should.
And the other issue is in trying to keep enlistment up, the military keep lowering their standards.
Yeah.
And so they're getting a lot of people who are joining the military just because they can't find another job.
Yeah.
They're overweight, part of the obesity crisis in this country, which is caused by food additives. We've talked about that before. So not only do they not have the numbers the troops they do have are less than effective. Again, going back to the USS Fitzgerald, the USS John S. McCain, and now the USS Shane as examples of all this very expensive technology being put under the command of people who don't really seem to understand what they're doing.
Yeah, and that's unfortunate. I'd like to go over to the UK and some statements made by their MI5 boss, Andrew Parker.
Okay.
UK terror threat evolving at a scale never seen before. And he defines this as a multidimensional threat that is rapidly evolving at a scale and pace that they have not seen before. And he mentioned that their security service is operating at an unprecedented level and has seen a dramatic upshift in threats this year. And he said today there's more terrorist activities coming at us more quickly, and it can be harder to detect. And they are now running well over 500 live operations, including 3,000 individuals known to currently be involved in extremist activity in some way.
Well, how's that open borders thing working out for you there,
well,
guys?
I'm going to ask for a word with this gentleman and a little logic. Now, the people uprooted from Iraq and Syria have every reason to be angry at the Anglo-U.S. wars against their countries, which has caused them to flee, sometimes with nothing more than the clothes on their backs. And these people were uprooted to impose regime change and ensure that their oil was only sold in U.S. dollars. The U.S. and Brits made it happen in Iraq, not so much in Syria yet. However, Israel is working hard to get another major war going there. And this unrestricted, unrestrained immigration has caused massive woes for you, Germany, Italy, Sweden, Denmark, and France. So here's about doing this intelligently. Why not only let the best of the best of the best come in? Meaning, these are people who are already proficient in English, want to assimilate, have meaningful job skills in the 21st century, and behave in a peaceful and civilized manner. It's called vetting, Andrew. There is no longer the America of the 19th century when the poet Emily Lazarus poem was put on the Statue of Liberty. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. The wretched refuse of your teeming shores, send these homeless tempest-tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door.
Well, they're
we
wonderful
can't
words.
Anymore.
Well, we didn't even back then.
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah.
it was all wonderful language and wonderful propaganda, but anybody coming to the United States still had to go through Ellis Island for a medical check, skills check, paperwork check. And those who didn't meet muster, were sent back home.
Yeah.
We're going to take a break for commercials. We'll be right back. And aloha, America. Welcome back to our show. Last segment of our program on this Pauhana Friday. And Claire, you've got an interesting story I see queued up next.
Very ironic. Apparently the city of Hartford, Connecticut, could default on its debt as soon as next month. This is an evaluation by Moody's, and it's a warning that is most dire. In a report issued yesterday, the ratings agency's analysts said Hartford, Connecticut's once proud capital city could default on its debt as soon as next month, forcing the capital of the country's wealthiest state on a per capita basis into bankruptcy. And it doesn't look like they have any kind of mechanism to prevent it, Mike.
No, they don't. A lot of people are moving out of Connecticut. Their tax base is shrinking.
Yep.
Their insurance industry has actually been harmed a great deal by Obamacare, and Connecticut their economy was very dependent on insurance. It was almost a joke that, if you were going to work in insurance, you were going to wind up being in Connecticut. They're in dire straits there. And again, they got into too much debt. There was always this attitude about, there'll be plenty of money to pay off the debt in the future. It doesn't work that way. Sooner or later, you reach a point of diminishing returns. And Connecticut's a beautiful state. I used to visit there all the time when I was living in New England. But again, we're seeing the end result of just over 100 years of this practice of a privately owned central bank being allowed to create money out of thin air and then loan it into circulation at interest. And the mechanism is very simple. By design, it produces more debt than money with which to pay the debt until the debt starts to crash the system. And that's what's happening in Hartford. It's what's happening in Baltimore and Chicago. It's what's happening to the nation as a whole.
Yeah.
Hartford, there'll be more of these bankruptcies. And again, we're not talking about a poor city or a poor state.
No.
This is the wealthiest state in the country on a per capita basis, and they can't even make ends meet, as it were.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's going to be pretty awful if that happens. And, you know, the people in Hartford in government, I will be willing to bet you they'll do one thing. They'll raise taxes, or they'll try to raise taxes.
They'll try and raise taxes, and that will drive more and more people out of the state seeking a lower tax haven.
Yeah.
And we might actually live to see a point where you're not allowed to leave your state the way, you know, without a lot of paperwork, the way you're not allowed to leave the country and renounce your citizenship without a lot of paperwork.
Yeah, that could be coming down
Got to keep the slaves in their corrals. Got to keep the slaves in the pens. Got to keep bleeding them for more and more money. And, you know, the problem with a money junkie is, even with all the wealth in the world in their pockets, it's never going to be enough because they're addicts.
Yeah, they still want more.
Yeah,
they still want more.
It isn't how much they've got now. It's that thrill of bringing in more. And it's a sickness, and we ought to recognize it is a sickness. It's probably the only mental illness for which there isn't a prescription medication out there on the market. So, all right, well, we're almost at the end of the show here, and have yourselves a really good weekend here. Stay safe. Keep on the lookout for those inevitable false flags that are happening all around us right now.
Yeah.
And I'm going to ask you all to please stay tuned for the John Stedmiller program, because he's got lots of interesting things to share with you on this Friday evening. So we'll be back on Monday here on the Republic Broadcasting Network. Please take what you learn here, share it with everybody that you know. We're in a war to get the truth over the liars. And we'll be back on Monday. Aloha, America.